suffered more, he would probably have considered me something worse.
Ownership settled, the team set about surveying the ruined city, measuring and mapping its buildings.
Catherwood is a remarkable character as well. I wish we knew more about him. One gains some sense of the Stevens personality just from the written word. The Catherwood personality doesn't emerge much. Stevens treats him very formally, and he appears as Mr. Catherwood.
At first, Mr. Catherwood found it almost impossible to draw the monuments. Their tropical luxuriance defied his restrained British hand.
Stevens mentions coming upon him in the woods one day. Catherwood standing in front of a big upright monument. It's a statue of one of the Copan rulers, and all intricately carved, and Catherwood standing there almost obscured by a pile of crumpled paper, which represents the output so far that day of unsuccessful attempts to draw this thing.
Fortunately, Catherwood had brought along a camera lucida, a box with a prism inside, which allowed him to trace a reflected image. To please the perfectionist Mr. Catherwood, every detail had to be correct. With the coming of spring, they were ready to begin the search for their next great goal, Palenque. The territory to the north, through the Sierra Madre Mountains, was wild and uncharted. As one local said, the roads to Palenque were only for birds. Snakes and clouds of mosquitoes dogged their steps. To Stevens, the worst part was the local custom of carrying a visitor up the steepest trails on a chair strapped to the back of an Indian.
I rose and fell with every breath, felt his body trembling under me, and his knees seemed giving way. The slightest irregular movement on my part might bring us both down together. I would have given him a release for the rest of the journey to be off his back.
On and on they traveled. It took more than a month to reach the fabled ruins that had first inspired their journey. Palenque seemed to hang on the edge of the mountains, its graceful buildings dominating the plain below.
Wherever we moved, we saw the evidences of their taste, their skill in arts, their wealth and power. In the midst of desolation and ruin, we looked back to the past, cleared away the gloomy forest, and fancied every building perfect, lofty and imposing.
Palenque's architecture was different from Copan's, but Stevens noticed many similarities, particularly the mysterious writing. Examining it carefully, he reached a remarkable conclusion.
There is room for the belief that the whole of this country was once occupied by the same race, speaking the same language, or at least having the same written characters.
The Indians Stevens met spoke many languages and were as mystified by the ruins as he was. Yet intuitively, Stevens seemed to sense a link between them.
Stevens, I think, is the first person who can make the connection between the Indians that he sees and meets and the ancient ruins. Whereas other people want to say, oh, these pathetic peasants, these miserable Indians, they could never have built this. We must look for some alternative solution to where these things would have come from. He believes that there is complete continuity. And that, I think, is one of the most radical ideas to come out of his book.
At night, Stevens and Catherwood slept in the imposing ruin they called the Palace. The rainy season had begun, and the mosquitoes, venomous during the day, were even worse at night. Catherwood was already racked with malaria. But somehow they kept on working. For 22 days and sleepless nights, bewitched by the beauty of Palenque. Exhausted, they pushed on, further north and east to the Yucatan. But Catherwood was too ill to continue. Vowing to return, they headed home to New York. In 10 months, the two explorers had accomplished the impossible. They'd rediscovered an ancient American civilization grander than anyone had ever dreamed. Now they were ready to astound the world with its story.
Stevens's book was incredibly popular when it appeared in the summer of 1841. Incidents of Travel in Central America, Chiapas, and Yucatan. Harper & Brothers had printed up a goodly print run, and it sold out pretty quickly.
Stevens writes a real page-turner. It's such a personal view. And it becomes one of the great bestsellers of the entire 19th century. It goes through dozens of editions, and there's an enormous American desire to know more about this part of the world.
They were lionized after the publication. They were quite the thing in New York, and it was reviewed everywhere, and just an amazing, publication, epic. So the trip was a success, and they planned to go again.
"17 months after they left Mexico, Stevens and Catherwood were back in the Yucatan, exploring the city of Uxmal. On this second journey, they concentrated their efforts on this one region of Mexico. Inching their way through the jungle, they discovered many ruined cities entirely unknown, with names like Caba, Labna, and Sail. Stevens felt they were racing against time. Everywhere they went, they found ruins collapsing into piles of rubble. Catherwood even learned how to sketch from his mule to save time. At Izamal, the artist drew the face of a god on the side of a pyramid. Years later, it was destroyed. Catherwood's illustration is our only record of it.
They performed the greatest service, perhaps, in freezing in time a set of observations and images of a land that no longer exists.
They're romantic pictures, yet at the same time, they're remarkably accurate. Many of Catherwood's renderings, for example, of the Maya at Uxmal and at Labna and other sites, are the first depictions that we have of what Maya people looked like. We have no earlier record.
In the town of Bolinchen, the explorers visited an ancient well deep underground. Catherwood was so inspired, he began his memorable sketch at the foot of the ladder.
It was the wildest setting that can be conceived. Men struggling up the huge ladder with earthen jars of water strapped to back and head, their sweating bodies glistening under the light of the pine torches.
One of the last places they explored was Chichen Itza. Its architecture moved them more than any other city on this second journey. Most exciting of all was the revelation that this city had been linked to Copan and Palenque, hundreds of miles away.
It was the first time in Yucatan that we had found hieroglyphics sculptured on stone, which beyond all question bore the same type with those at Copan and Palenque. If one could but read it.
Finally, Stevens felt he had the proof he'd been looking for. The mysterious writing was unique, unlike any he'd ever seen. Now, he could convince the skeptics that the ruined cities had been built by Native Americans.
These ruins are different from the works of any other known people, of a new order. They stand alone.
In the 9 months of their second journey, Stevens and Catherwood managed to visit 44 ruined cities and gather some treasures for an exhibition on their return. But they paid a heavy price for their adventures. Malaria would haunt both men for the rest of their lives. John Lloyd Stevens would fight the dread disease for 10 years before succumbing to it in 1852. Frederick Catherwood would die tragically a few years later in a shipwreck. This is the only image we have of him. For there was another sad chapter to their story. The fate of the great exhibition they held on their return to New York.
This fire started one night in July of 1842 and literally overnight wiped out the physical originals, the drawings, some of the archaeological stuff, the limestone carvings that they had brought back at great labor. Thank goodness for the books. And I thank the fates every day that somebody at Harper & Brothers, publishers in New York, had the foresight to heavily illustrate the book, because what a shame if the drawings had been lost.
Fortunately, before he died, Catherwood issued exquisite folios of some of the drawings. They inspired generations of explorers to follow the intrepid pair to the land of the Maya. But Stevens' insights would have a different fate. His greatest intuition, that the Maya had written the real stories of their lives on their monuments, would be ignored. The legions of archaeologists who came after him were able to decipher some of the glyphs, but only those that spoke of numbers, dates, and the stars. Carried away by the discovery that the ancient Maya were great astronomers, archaeologists fashioned a picture of them as peaceful stargazers, obsessed with calendars and time.